My niece looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Uncle James, please don't embarrass me tonight. These are important people." She adjusted her silk dress, glanced at my navy button-down and weathered work boots, and walked away without waiting for a reply. I stood there holding a glass of champagne I didn't order in a ballroom filled with politicians who wouldn't know a 12-hour shift if it punched them in the chest. Then the keynote speaker stepped to the microphone, scanned the crowd, and said 8 words that made my niece's face drain white. "Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Mitchell is here." Every head turned toward me. My name is James Mitchell. I'm 62 years old, a union electrician who never finished college, and for the last 4 years, I've been the governor. I still live in the same house my wife and I bought in 1989. I answer my own door, and until that moment, my niece had no clue. She thought she was tolerating her strange old uncle. She didn't know that everyone in that room had paid to hear me speak, and that what I was about to say would challenge everything her party stood for. But that night wasn't just about her ignorance. It was about a secret I'd been carrying for 6 months, a secret that would either cement my legacy or burn it all to the ground. To understand how I ended up in that ballroom, you have to go back 6 months, to the night I sat alone in the governor's mansion, staring at a manila envelope that had been slid under my door sometime after midnight. Inside were documents, bank records, shell company filings, internal memos, all tracing back to one name, Harrison DeWitt, the largest private donor to my party in the state, the man who had contributed more than $4 million to my last campaign alone. And according to what I held in my hands, the man systematically looting the state's infrastructure fund to enrich himself and a handful of allies. I read the documents twice, then a third time. By dawn, I knew 2 things with absolute certainty. 1, this was the biggest corruption scandal to hit this state in 30 years. And 2, if I exposed it, I would lose everything. My re-election, my allies, possibly my freedom if the retaliation was harsh enough. I'm not a career politician. I was a journeyman electrician who spent 31 years pulling wire through crawl spaces and running conduit up the sides of commercial buildings. I never planned to run for office. But when the old governor tried to cut prevailing wage laws and gut union protections, I went to the State House with 300 other tradesmen to testify. Somebody handed me a microphone. Somebody else put my speech on YouTube. 2 years later, I won the governorship by 12,000 votes, the narrowest margin in state history. I still kept my union card in my wallet. I still drove a 12-year-old pickup truck. And I still believed that a person's word was the only contract that mattered. A late wife, Elaine, understood that better than anyone. She died of ovarian cancer 8 years ago, long before I ever thought about politics. But she was the one who taught me that a life built on convenience crumbles the moment it's tested. Elaine was a high school history teacher. She didn't care about status. She cared about truth. And the last thing she ever said to me, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers, was this: "Don't let them make you small, James." I've carried those words like a talisman ever since. The manila envelope didn't arrive by accident. It came from a whistleblower inside DeWitt's organization, a junior accountant who'd stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to see. He was terrified. He said if I didn't act, he'd go to the press, and then I'd look complicit. He gave me 6 weeks to decide. I spent those weeks doing what I've always done. I went to work. I attended ribbon cuttings. I shook hands with donors, including Harrison DeWitt himself, at a gala in the capital city just 3 weeks after I received the documents. He smiled and clapped me on the shoulder and told me he was proud of the work we were doing together. I smiled back and said nothing. But at night, in the quiet of the mansion, I was constructing a different kind of wiring diagram, tracing the connections, the subcontractors who'd been paid for projects that never existed, the inflated invoices, the consultants who were paid to do nothing. And everywhere I looked, I found DeWitt's fingerprints. His network extended deep into my own administration. 2 of my senior advisors had financial ties to his companies. One of them was my own chief of staff. I confronted him in my office on a Thursday morning. He didn't deny it. He said that this was how things worked, that every successful governor learned to manage uncomfortable truths, that if I tried to expose DeWitt, I would destroy my own career and accomplish nothing. He called it pragmatism. I called it surrender. That was the moment I decided. Not a grand, cinematic decision, just a quiet understanding that I couldn't live with myself if I looked away. I told my chief of staff to resign by the end of the week. He laughed, told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life, and walked out. He was on DeWitt's payroll as a consultant within 48 hours. But here's the part nobody tells you about taking a stand. It doesn't feel brave in the moment. It feels terrifying and lonely and absurdly fragile. You lie awake at 3 in the morning running through all the ways it could go wrong. You imagine the headlines, the investigations, the late-night talk show jokes. You wonder if Elaine would be proud, or if she'd tell you that you'd thrown away everything you'd built for a principle that nobody would remember. And then you think about your family. My oldest sister, Patricia, is the reason the niece in that ballroom existed at all. Patricia married well. Her husband is a corporate attorney. They live in a gated community in the wealthiest suburb of the capital. They raised their daughter, Emily, to believe that success means cocktail parties and donor access and the right people knowing your name. Emily works as a fundraiser for the party. My party, technically, though in practice, she has more in common with DeWitt's world than with mine. Emily never visited me at my house in the old neighborhood. She never met Elaine. She didn't come to the Union Hall when I announced my candidacy, and she certainly didn't volunteer for my campaign. To her, I was the strange uncle who talked too much about wiring gauges and minimum wage, an embarrassment, a relic. I saw her maybe twice a year, at Christmas gatherings where she spent most of her time on her phone. That's why she didn't recognize me at the fundraiser. She'd never bothered to look at me long enough to know my face. But there was another family connection, one I haven't talked about publicly. My son David, he works in construction like I did. He's a foreman for a commercial contractor, 37 years old with a wife and 2 daughters. And 6 months ago, he sat in my kitchen and told me something that shattered me. His company had been bidding on a major infrastructure project, a bridge replacement funded by the state. The bids kept getting rejected, even though their numbers were competitive. Eventually, a supervisor told him the truth. All those contracts were being steered to DeWitt-connected firms. There was no real competition, and if David wanted to keep his job, he needed to stop asking questions. I looked my son in the eyes and saw the same exhaustion I'd felt when I was his age, the sense that the game was rigged, and the people who rigged it would never be held accountable. I told him to trust me. I didn't tell him what I was planning, but that night, I went back to the manila envelope and read every page again. And I knew that whatever happened next, I couldn't protect my son by staying silent. Silence was what made the rigging possible. The fundraiser was scheduled for the second Saturday in October, $1,000 a plate at the Grand Ballroom downtown. The keynote speaker was supposed to be Senator Aldrich, the party's rising star, but 2 days before the event, Aldrich canceled. His office cited a scheduling conflict. I learned later that DeWitt had gotten to him. DeWitt was starting to suspect that something was coming, and he was circling the wagons. So the event organizers asked me to speak in Aldrich's place. They didn't know what I was about to announce. Nobody did, not my remaining staff, not my security detail, not my son. Only one person in the world knew the full scope of what I was carrying, a reporter named Claudia Vasquez from the state's largest newspaper. I'd invited her to the mansion 3 days earlier and given her everything, every document, every name, every transaction. She agreed to hold the story until after my speech. The indictment would be filed Monday morning. But first, I had to face that room full of donors and tell them, to their faces, that their system was corrupt. The afternoon of the fundraiser, I put on my navy button-down shirt, the one Elaine gave me for our 20th anniversary. It still fit. It still felt like armor. I didn't wear a suit because I'm not a suit. I drove myself to the venue in my pickup truck, the same one I've had for 12 years. The valet looked confused when I pulled up. The catering staff gave me sideways glances as I walked through the service entrance. And then my niece saw me, Emily, standing near the check-in table, holding a clipboard, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first month's mortgage. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stray dog that wandered into a wedding reception. She marched over, planted herself in front of me, and said the words that would seal everything. "Uncle James, please don't embarrass me tonight. These are important people." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to explain that the entire room was about to be embarrassed, that every important person she was so desperate to impress was about to have their world upended, but I just nodded and watched her walk away. Then the lights dimmed. The keynote speaker stepped to the microphone, and when he said my name, I felt the weight of 6 months of silence lift off my shoulders. I stood up from my table. 1,000 faces turned toward me, and I began to walk toward the stage, carrying the secret that would either redeem everything I stood for or reduce my entire life to rubble. The walk from my table to the stage was maybe 30 steps. It felt like 30 miles. The ballroom had gone so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. I kept my eyes forward, but in my peripheral vision I could see Emily frozen near the check-in table, her clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. She didn't know. None of them knew. And for just a moment, I felt something that wasn't fear or dread or even anger. I felt a strange, quiet pity for all of them. I stepped onto the low platform, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at 1,000 faces. The wealthiest people in the state, donors, lobbyists, former colleagues, people who'd written checks expecting to buy access. My hands were steady. Elaine's shirt fit me like a second skin, and I began. For 20 minutes tonight, I'm not going to talk about our party's future. I'm not going to talk about the next election cycle or our legislative agenda or our polling numbers. I'm going to talk about truth, not the polite, edited, focus-grouped version of truth that gets served at events like this one. The actual truth, the kind that has been buried so deep in this state that most of you don't even remember where you hid it. Someone coughed. The sound echoed across the silent room. I saw Emily's mouth open slightly. 6 months ago, I received a manila envelope. It contained documents, bank records, shell company filings, internal memos, all of them pointing to one conclusion. A network of individuals has been systematically siphoning money from the state's infrastructure fund, hundreds of millions of dollars diverted into private accounts through a web of fake subcontractors, inflated invoices, and no-bid contracts. The man at the center of that network is sitting in this room tonight. The silence that followed wasn't silence, it was absence, a vacuum where breath used to be. A few heads turned toward the back of the room where Harrison DeWitt's table was empty. He wasn't there, but his lieutenants were, and they looked like men who just realized the fire exit was locked. I continued, I'm not a career politician, I'm a journeyman electrician who got angry at the right moment. I've spent my life looking at systems that are supposed to work, finding the fault and fixing it. The system in this state is broken, not because of the other party, because of us, because we allowed it to become normal to trade public trust for private profit. Tonight, I'm ending that normalization. Effective immediately, I am ordering a full, independent investigation into all infrastructure contracts awarded in the past 8 years. And I am publicly naming the man whose organization I believe is responsible for the largest portion of the fraud, Harrison DeWitt. I had expected gasping, shouting, maybe the sound of chairs scraping as half the room walked out. Instead, the silence continued for a full 3 seconds after I stopped speaking. Then it broke, not into noise, but into a low, panicked hum, like a machine running too hot, people pulling out phones, people standing and moving toward the exits, not in a rush, but in the dazed shuffle of a crowd that hasn't yet processed what it's hearing. I stayed at the podium for 17 more minutes, laying out the evidence, dead companies that had been paid millions, projects that existed only on paper, the names of middlemen who had laundered the money. I watched the faces in the crowd as I named them. Some blanched, some turned to stone, some looked at me with an expression I'd never seen directed at me before, pure, undiluted hatred. Emily was standing exactly where I'd left her, but her clipboard was on the floor now. Her face had gone white. When our eyes met, I saw confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like grief. Not for me, for herself, for the career she'd just watched catch fire. When I finished, I stepped down from the podium and walked not toward the exit, but toward her. She didn't run. She stood her ground, even though her hands were shaking. "Uncle James," she said, and the way she said it was different from an hour earlier. Then it had been dismissive. Now it was almost pleading. "You didn't tell me any of this. You let me say those things to you and you just stood there." "I stood there because it was the only way you'd ever hear what I had to say," I told her. "If I'd introduced myself as your uncle the governor, you would have listened to me for all the wrong reasons. Now you'll actually have to decide what you believe." Then I turned and walked toward the service entrance, where my truck was waiting. The first threat came before I'd even pulled out of the parking garage. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Enjoy the next 48 hours. They'll be the last ones you spend as a free man. I saved it and sent it to Claudia Vasquez, the reporter who had the full story. She'd been sitting in the back of the ballroom, recording everything. Her story was already written. It was set to publish online in 2 hours. By the time I reached the mansion, my phone had become a weapon aimed back at me. 43 missed calls, voice messages I couldn't bear to listen to yet. The state party chair had left a voicemail that I played for my security detail as I walked through the front doors. "This is political suicide," he said through gritted teeth. "You have not just shot yourself, you have shot every elected official who has ever accepted $1 from DeWitt, which is most of them. Do not expect support from this office. Do not expect anything but total isolation." I poured a cup of coffee from the cold pot I'd left that morning and sat down at the kitchen table. The table was an old oak thing that Elaine and I had bought at a flea market 30 years ago. I'd been sitting at this table when I decided to run for governor, when I signed the papers, when I learned I'd won. Now I was sitting at it wondering if I'd thrown away everything I'd spent 4 years building. The next call I made wasn't to an ally or a staffer. It was to my son, David. I needed to warn him that things were about to get difficult, and I needed to hear my granddaughter's voice on the other end of the line. But David answered on the second ring, and his voice was strained. "Dad, something happened. 2 guys showed up at the job site this afternoon before your speech. They talked to my supervisor. Half an hour later, I was laid off. No reason, no severance. My whole crew was reassigned." The knot in my stomach that had loosened slightly when I stepped off that stage tightened again harder. This was the part I'd feared most. Not the career damage, not the isolation, not the legal threats. The part where what I did rolled downhill and crushed my own family. I asked him what the men looked like, what company they'd said they were from. He gave me descriptions. Generic suits, generic badge IDs, but one detail stood out. They'd said they were from a compliance review team. That was DeWitt's language. He had a private security firm that did exactly this kind of thing, intimidation disguised as procedure. I told David to pack up his family and come to the mansion. It was the only place I could control, the only place I could ensure their safety while the storm played out. He argued for a moment, then stopped. He knew, he'd known since I asked him to trust me months ago that this day might come. The house fell quiet around midnight. Claudia's story had gone live, and the initial shockwave was already spreading across national media. My phone lit up with alerts. Breaking, Governor alleges massive corruption ring, top donor named. I scrolled through reactions, outrage from some corners, skepticism from others, prominent party figures rushing to distance themselves. And from DeWitt's camp, a statement issued through a high-priced crisis PR firm. "These baseless allegations are the desperate act of a lame duck governor seeking attention. Mr. DeWitt will be fully vindicated." I knew what that statement really meant. It meant DeWitt was buying time, enough time to destroy evidence, pressure witnesses, and discredit me before any formal investigation could take root. I'd anticipated this. I had copies of everything stored in multiple locations, but there was something I hadn't anticipated, something that changed the entire calculus. At 2 in the morning, my personal cell phone rang. Not the governor's phone, the private number only a handful of people had. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't expected, Timothy Arlen, my own lieutenant governor, a man I'd never fully trusted but had always respected. His voice was oddly calm. "James," he said, "I've just had a very interesting conversation with some people who are very interested in making this situation go away. They made a proposal. I'm calling because I think you should hear it directly before they go public with it." "What proposal?" I asked. "They have evidence, James. Evidence that your son's company knowingly submitted falsified bid documents for a bridge contract 3 years ago. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying they can make it look true, enough to trigger an investigation, enough to indict. And they're prepared to do it unless you rescind your statement tonight and announce that you're leaving office for health reasons. Resign, go quietly. They'll drop the whole thing." The world contracted to the sound of my own heartbeat, David's company. I remembered the conversation in my kitchen months earlier when he'd told me about the rigged bidding process. He'd said his bids kept getting rejected. He'd never suggested anyone on his side was doing anything illegal. But if DeWitt's network was as extensive as I believed, they could fabricate documentation, plant emails, corrupt witnesses. My son could be destroyed, all because I'd decided to take a stand. I told Arlen I needed time to think. He said I had until noon tomorrow. Then he hung up, and I sat in the darkness of my kitchen, staring at the oak table where Elaine used to grade papers, and I realized I was facing a choice I'd never prepared for. My principles or my son, the state or my family. And there wasn't a diagram in any electrician's manual that could wire around that. But then the phone buzzed again. A text from Claudia Vasquez. Need to meet immediately. New documents. It's bigger than DeWitt. It goes federal. I opened the attachment, and what I saw made me forget the lieutenant governor's threat entirely. Because if what I was looking at was real, my own life was about to become the smallest part of this story. I met Claudia Vasquez at 3 in the morning in a parking garage on the south side of the Capitol. The kind of place where the fluorescent lights buzz and flicker and nobody asks questions. She was standing beside her car with a laptop balanced on the hood, and her face was pale in the screen's glow. She didn't say hello. She just handed me the laptop. The new documents weren't about infrastructure contracts. Not directly. They were bank transfer records showing systematic payments from a Delaware-based shell company into accounts controlled by a defense contractor in Virginia. The contractor had received over $200 million in federal military construction grants over the past 5 years, and the shell company traced back to a familiar signature, Harrison DeWitt's private equity firm. The same firm that had been siphoning state road money was also laundering federal defense dollars. But it got worse. Embedded in the documents was a single email thread, a conversation between DeWitt and a sitting United States congressman. The congressman was coordinating committee assignments to steer contracts towards specific districts where DeWitt had property holdings. The email was from 18 months ago. The implication was nuclear level. This wasn't just state corruption. This was a federal conspiracy involving elected officials in Washington. I looked up at Claudia. Is this verified? The source sent it to me an hour after your speech went live, she said. I've authenticated the metadata. It's real. And the FBI already has a copy. I'm telling you this because within 48 hours, the Bureau is going to announce an investigation that makes your little speech look like a parking ticket. You're not just a governor exposing corruption anymore. You're a witness in a federal case, maybe the most important witness they have. I thought about the lieutenant governor's threat, the promise to fabricate evidence against my son. It had felt like the lever that would force me to fold. Now I realized it was something else entirely. It was proof that DeWitt's network would stop at nothing, and that included destroying anyone connected to me. David wasn't just a bargaining chip, he was a target. And the only way to protect him was to ensure that DeWitt's entire operation was dismantled so thoroughly that no one could ever threaten him again. The sun was rising when I got back to the mansion. David and his family had arrived overnight. My granddaughters, aged 9 and 7, were asleep in a guest room down the hall. David was sitting in the kitchen when I walked in, holding a cup of coffee with both hands. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. I'm being investigated, he said. State police showed up at the mansion gates an hour ago with a subpoena for my employment records. They're claiming I falsified bid documents on a bridge project 2 years ago. Dad, I didn't do anything. I swear to God, I never even saw those documents they're talking about. I know you didn't, I said. This is retaliation. They're trying to break me by breaking you, and the person giving the orders is standing one office away from mine. I told him about Arlen, about the midnight phone call, about the choice I'd been given, resign or watch your son be indicted. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set his coffee down very carefully. So what are you going to do? He asked. I'm going to do what Elaine would have told me to do, I said. I'm going to fight, but not alone, and not stupid. The next 24 hours were a cascade of disasters that someone had clearly orchestrated. DeWitt held a press conference at 10 that morning, flanked by lawyers, and read a statement that painted me as a vengeful, unstable figure who'd fabricated evidence to settle a personal grudge. He produced what he called a whistleblower affidavit from a former employee of David's company who claimed to have witnessed bid manipulation. The employee was a man named Gerald Fitch, who'd been fired from the company 18 months earlier for falsifying time cards. I knew this because David had told me about him, but the media didn't know that. The media ran with the story. By noon, 3 state legislators had called for my impeachment. The state party chair issued a statement expressing grave concern about my judgment and fitness for office. A prominent cable news host devoted an entire segment to what he called the governor guillotine. The hashtag Resign Mitchell was trending. And then Emily walked into the mansion. She didn't knock, she just appeared in the doorway of my office at 2 in the afternoon, her eyes red-rimmed and her hands trembling. "They fired me," she said. "The party, my firm, all of it. They said my connection to you made me a liability. I've spent 5 years building my career, and they erased it in one phone call because I happened to share your DNA." I waited. There was something in her voice that wasn't just self-pity. There was anger, and anger, aimed in the right direction, is fuel. "I want to help you," she said. "I know things. I know the donor networks. I know how DeWitt's people communicate. I know which staffers are loyal to which benefactors. I was inside that machine, Uncle James. I was part of it, and I didn't see what it really was until last night when you named it. Let me make this right." It was a risk, a significant one. Emily had spent years dismissing me, and now she was standing in my office offering to become an ally. But I've learned something in 62 years of living. People deserve the chance to change, not because it's noble, but because it's practical. A person who's been humbled is far more useful than a person who's always been right. "Tell me everything," I said. And she did. For 3 hours, she walked me through the informal power map of the state's donor class. She told me about the quiet dinners where contracts were informally apportioned before any public bidding process began. She told me about the consultants who functioned as bagmen, moving money through layers of LLCs so no single transaction ever looked suspicious. She told me about Arlen. The lieutenant governor had been on DeWitt's payroll for at least 6 years, long before my administration. He'd been installed specifically to manage the political side of the operation. When I won the governorship, I hadn't chosen him as my running mate. The party had forced him on me. Now I knew why. That evening, I received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was female, measured, professional. "Governor Mitchell, my name is Special Agent Maria Okonkwo with the FBI. We need to meet. Tonight, I'm aware of the threat against your son. I'm also aware that you're in possession of documents that are critical to an ongoing federal investigation. You're not alone in this, but you need to trust me enough to take the next step." We met at a safe house on the outskirts of the capital. Agent Okonkwo was a woman in her 40s with the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms full of people who underestimated her and had learned to use that as her primary weapon. She laid out the federal investigation with clinical precision. They had been tracking DeWitt's network for 22 months. They had wiretaps, financial records, cooperating witnesses. But they needed one more thing to bring a racketeering case that would survive the inevitable legal counter-assault. They needed direct evidence that the conspiracy included state officials who were actively obstructing justice. Specifically, they needed my lieutenant governor on tape admitting to the extortion attempt against me. "We want you to wear a wire," she said. "Arlen is scheduled to meet with you tomorrow morning to demand your resignation again. If you can get him to repeat the threat against your son while we're recording, we can charge him with obstruction and conspiracy within hours. That gives us the leverage to roll up the entire network, including DeWitt, before they can destroy any more evidence." I thought about what she was asking. I would be walking into a conversation with a man who had already demonstrated he was willing to destroy my family, a man who had spent 6 years working for my political destruction, and I would have to stay calm, stay controlled, lead him into saying exactly what he'd said before, only this time with the weight of a federal recording behind it. "What about my son?" I asked. "They're already moving to indict him on fabricated charges." "If you get Arlen on tape, those charges never materialize. We'll have enough to show the state attorney general that the case is a fabrication. David will be cleared, but you have to do this, and you have to do it tomorrow." I looked at her for a long moment. Outside the safe house window, the city lights blurred against the dark. Elaine's voice echoed somewhere in the back of my mind. Don't let them make you small, James. I'll do it, I said, but I want a guarantee. If something happens to me, if this goes sideways and I'm removed from office, the federal case doesn't stop. You keep going. You take them all down, that's my price. Agent Okonkwo nodded. That's already the plan. The drive back to the mansion was the longest 30 minutes of my life. I thought about my granddaughters sleeping in that guest room. I thought about David, who was facing the destruction of everything he'd built. I thought about Emily, who had spent years chasing the approval of people who were now discarding her like garbage. And I thought about myself, the journeyman electrician who'd stumbled into politics because he was angry about wage laws. The man who still kept his union card in his wallet. The man who'd stood on a stage and named the truth, and then realized the truth was far bigger and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Tomorrow I would walk into a room wearing a wire and try to trap a man who had spent his entire career learning how to trap other people. If I succeeded, the largest political corruption case in a generation would have its foundation. If I failed, I would lose my office, my reputation, and possibly my son's freedom. And the people who had rigged the system would keep running it, untouchable forever. I pulled into the mansion driveway, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for a moment. The pickup truck's cab smelled like coffee and old vinyl, just like it always had. Just like the truck I'd driven to the Union Hall years ago when someone handed me a microphone and changed everything. I was still that man. I just wasn't sure if that man was enough. Then my phone buzzed one more time. Emily, a text. I found something. Arlen's assistant has been shredding documents all evening. I have photos. It's worse than we thought. Call me. The morning was coming, and with it, the most dangerous conversation of my life. I called Emily back from the darkness of that driveway. She told me she'd been at the State House, going through a storage closet where Arlen's assistant had dumped bags of shredded paper before the cleaning crew arrived. She'd pulled out strips and pieced them together. They were financial disclosures that should have been filed and never were. Disclosures showing Arlen had received direct payments from DeWitt's private equity firm as recently as last month. The assistant hadn't shredded everything. He'd run out of time, and Emily had photographed the evidence before security escorted her out. I sent the photos to Agent Okonkwo. By dawn, the FBI had added conspiracy and destruction of evidence to the charges they were preparing. At 7:30 in the morning, a technician arrived at the mansion and fitted me with a wire. A thin microphone taped to my chest, a transmitter the size of a matchbox in my jacket pocket. We tested it twice. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. I was an electrician. I'd spent a career working with wiring that could kill you. This was just another circuit that needed to be closed. Arlen arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, walking into my office like he already owned it. He didn't sit down when I offered him a chair. He stood by the window, looking out at the Capitol building in the distance, and he spoke without turning around. James, you've made this harder than it needed to be. The party is prepared to move forward with impeachment proceedings by end of week. The state attorney general's office has opened an investigation into your son's company based on the whistleblower testimony. You have one option left. Resign today, effective immediately, citing health reasons. In exchange, the investigation into your son goes away. The fabricated evidence disappears. David goes back to work. Your granddaughters never have to know any of this happened. I counted to 3 in my head. I thought about the microphone against my skin. Say that again, I said, the part about fabricated evidence. He finally turned. His eyes were flat and gray like dirty snow. Don't be naive, James. Of course it's fabricated. Your son is clean, but we have enough to make it stick. You know how the process works. The accusation is enough. The legal bills alone will destroy him. His marriage, his career, his reputation, all gone. And for what? So you can feel righteous while your family burns? Resign now, while you still have something left to save. What if I don't? Then tomorrow morning, Gerald Fitch's affidavit becomes public, and the indictment follows within the week. I've seen the documents. They're convincing. Your son's signature on a falsified bid form, emails from his account approving inflated cost estimates. It doesn't matter that it's not real. It looks real. And by the time anyone figures out the truth, David Mitchell will be bankrupt and unemployable. He paused. You have until noon. He walked toward the door. I let him get 3 steps away before I spoke. Arlen, one more question. How long have you been on DeWitt's payroll? 6 years? 7. He stopped. His hand hovered near the door handle. You're a fool, he said quietly. You were always a fool. You stumbled into this office by accident, and you've been stumbling ever since. Then he was gone. I sat alone for a full minute before I touched the transmitter in my pocket and spoke to Agent Okonkwo. Did you get it? Every word, she said. The arrest team is moving now. Arlen won't make it to the parking lot. They took him in the corridor outside the mansion gates, 3 FBI agents and 2 state police officers who had been briefed only hours earlier. Arlen didn't resist. He looked almost relieved, the way a man looks when the performance he's been maintaining for years finally collapses. He was charged with extortion, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and bribery of a public official. The news broke at 9:15. By noon, DeWitt was in custody. The federal arrest warrant had been sealed for 3 days, waiting for the exact moment when the case against Arlen provided the final piece of the puzzle. DeWitt was taken from his home in the wealthiest precinct of the capital, the same home where he'd hosted fundraisers attended by half the state legislature. The mugshot, when it appeared on every screen in the country an hour later, showed a man who had aged 20 years since the previous morning. The congressman whose name appeared in those emails resigned within 48 hours. 2 state senators and a deputy commissioner followed. The network that had seemed invincible a week earlier unraveled at the speed of panic, each arrest yielding new names, new evidence, new indictments. Claudia Vasquez's paper won a National Journalism Award for their coverage. Agent Okonkwo was promoted to senior field supervisor, and my son David never faced a single charge. The case against him was withdrawn before the ink on Arlen's indictment was dry. But not everything healed quickly. The state party disowned me. They stripped my committee assignments, froze my access to party funds, and issued a formal censure. I'd expected that. What I hadn't expected was what happened next. A week after the arrests, 15,000 people gathered on the lawn outside the State House, holding signs that didn't mention DeWitt or Arlen. The signs said, "Thank you, Governor Mitchell." They were electricians, carpenters, pipefitters, teachers, nurses, farmers from the rural counties who'd never donated a dollar to any campaign. The people who had been losing the war for decades and had finally watched someone land a blow on their behalf. I stood on the Capitol steps and looked at them, and I couldn't speak for a long moment because the weight of the past 6 months was finally pressing down on me with the force of something released, not trapped. Emily was in the crowd. She'd found a new job, not as a party fundraiser, but as an investigator for a nonprofit that monitored government transparency. She'd gone from managing donor relationships to exposing them. When the crowd dispersed, she walked up to me and said very simply, "I see you now." I told her I'd always been there. She nodded. "That's the problem, isn't it? You were always there, and I was too busy looking past you to notice." She hugged me. It was the first real hug she'd given me in her adult life. David's company was eventually exonerated and awarded the bridge contract they'd been denied 18 months earlier. They bid it fair, and this time they won it fair because the corruption that had steered contracts to DeWitt's allies no longer existed. My granddaughters drew pictures of their grandfather on the news, standing next to FBI agents, and when I asked the older one what she thought about all of it, she said, "You were brave because you told the truth." I've kept that drawing on my refrigerator ever since. The federal case took 2 years to fully adjudicate. DeWitt was convicted on 17 counts of racketeering, money laundering, and public corruption. He received 22 years. Arlen received 14. The junior accountant who'd sent me that first manila envelope, the one whose name I never learned until after the trial, was a young man named Samuel Park. He was 26 years old. His father, a union laborer named Robert Park, had been killed in a construction accident 11 years earlier on a job site that DeWitt's company was supposed to have inspected for safety violations. The inspection never happened. The death was ruled an accident. Samuel Park had carried that knowledge into his career as an accountant, and when he saw his employer doing the same things that had killed his father, he found a manila envelope and a governor's mansion and a way to finally make it right. I met him after the trial. We sat in my kitchen at the old oak table, and we talked about loss and anger and the long arc of justice. He asked me if I thought it was worth it. I told him what I'd learned. It's not about whether it's worth it, it's about whether you can live with yourself if you don't. And here's the final thing, the surprising detail nobody saw coming. 6 months after the convictions, I announced I would not run for re-election. The pundits said I'd have won. The polls showed me 20 points ahead. But I didn't run because winning isn't the same as being done. I'd spent 4 years in office and the last 6 months in a kind of battle I'd never trained for, and I was tired. Not the tired of a bad night's sleep. The tired of a man who has carried something heavy up a long hill and finally set it down. I wanted to sit on my porch and watch the oak tree in my backyard drop its leaves. I wanted to teach my granddaughters how to wire a light switch. I wanted to be James Mitchell again, not Governor Mitchell, not the whistleblower governor, just the old electrician who still had his union card in his wallet and still drove a truck that smelled like coffee and vinyl. I still have that navy button-down shirt, Elaine's gift. I wore it on my last day in office when I walked out of the mansion for the final time and drove myself home. The same valet who'd looked confused on the night of the fundraiser was standing at the gate. This time, he nodded and smiled and said, "Good luck, Governor." I told him to call me James. Then I put the truck in gear and headed for the old neighborhood, where the foundation was sound and the wiring was true, and I finally understood what I'd been building all my life. It wasn't a career. It wasn't a legacy. It was a place where the truth could live and where the people I loved would always have a circuit back home. We tell ourselves stories about power, that it belongs to the wealthy, the connected, the people who know the right hands to shake, that it's a closed system, impenetrable, permanent. And for most of my life, I believed that story too. I believed that men like Harrison DeWitt would always win because the game was rigged and the referees were paid. I was wrong, not because the system isn't rigged. It is, but because rigged systems have a structural weakness that no amount of money can fix. They depend on the silence of the people who see the truth and choose not to speak. Samuel Parks sent an envelope, a junior accountant who'd been carrying his father's death for 11 years. He didn't have power or influence or even a guarantee that anyone would listen. He had one thing, the refusal to stay silent. And that single refusal, that one act of saying this far and no further, traveled through a chain of people who made the same choice. A governor who'd once been an electrician, a reporter who stayed up all night verifying documents, an FBI agent who built a case brick by brick, even a young fundraiser who realized she'd been serving the wrong masters. The cascade that brought down a statewide corruption network started with someone who had no reason to believe his voice would matter. That's the part we forget when we look at the scale of what's broken and decide it's too big to fix. Every system is made of people making choices, and the moment enough people choose differently, the system shifts. I'm not in office anymore. I sit on my porch most evenings now, watching the oak tree Elaine and I planted. I fix things around the house. I taught my granddaughters how to wire an outlet last weekend. They were terrible at it, but they'll learn. What matters is that they know they're allowed to try, that they're allowed to ask how things work and why things are the way they are and whether they could be different. That's the inheritance I want to leave them, not just a house or a name. The understanding that they are not passengers in their own lives. The people who tell you to lower your voice, to accept the unacceptable, to trade your principles for convenience, they're not protecting you, they're protecting themselves. And when you finally speak, they will call you reckless or naive or ungrateful. Let them. The truth doesn't require their permission, and it doesn't wait for an invitation. If you take anything from this story, take this. The foundation holds because you maintain it, not because someone else will, not because the system will fix itself, because ordinary people in ordinary rooms make choices that echo far beyond anything they can see. That's what I learned in 31 years of pulling wire and 4 years of sitting behind a desk with a title that never really fit me. Power isn't conferred, it's claimed, and anyone can claim it. If you believe that stories like this still matter, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to see more, hit subscribe. The truth is always running just beneath the surface. You just have to be willing to dig.